everyone, and welcome to the .NET Core Podcast, an award-winning podcast where we reach into the core of the .NET technology stack and, with the help of the .NET community, present you with the information that you need in order to grok the many moving parts of one of the biggest cross-platform multi-application frameworks on the planet. I am your host, Jamie GaProgMan Taylor. In this episode, I talked with Geoffrey Huntley about how the Open.NET project could help lead to greater and faster innovation within the .NET community via community ownership, something that other languages and frameworks have already adopted. Along the way, we discussed some of the recent controversies surrounding some of the key decisions in the .NET space from 2021. We chose to discuss these topics in a positive manner, attempting to bring them to light, but also allowing for a constructive discourse on how any future issues could potentially be avoided. I ask that you take our discussion in the spirit in which it is intended, one of support and of constructive feedback. Throughout this interview, I attempted to stay in the middle of the road, so to speak, with regards to this conversation. I wanted to neither defend nor attack any of the decisions that have been made, and hopefully it will come through. This is not to say that Geoffrey is defending or attacking, he's just raising some points that it is worth discussing in this area. So let's sit back, open up a terminal, type in .NET New Podcast, and let the show begin. So thank you ever so much, Jeff, for being on the show. I really appreciate it. We're in completely different time zones on the opposite ends of the world. I'm in the UK and you're somewhere in deepest Australia. So I appreciate that you've had to sort of juggle your day around to fit me in. So I do apologize for that, but I also thank you ever so much.
No problem, Jamie. Thanks for having me on. There's so much we need to talk about. There's been a whole bunch of events that's happened in the .NET space. And I hope to kind of bring people up to speed of some of the things that have happened, so people can understand why the community has been upset. People will say it's just drama. Well, that's one way to dismiss how people are validly feeling about something they love.
Sure. Yeah, we'll definitely have to discuss that because it's quite important. I feel like it's good to be able to criticize something that you enjoy or like or have positive feelings for, because then you can sort of see it from both sides, right? You can say, hey, for instance, I'm very keen on video games. I'm very happy to say, hey, I love this video game, but it's got some problems, And I feel like having that discussion it's a nice balanced discussion. And like you say, there's some very important things that have happened when this episode goes out last year, because we're putting this out in 2022. Right at the beginning. So new year, new start. Let's talk about these things. But before we can get to those, would you mind giving the listeners a really quite brief introduction to yourself? A little bit of sort of color information about yourself so we know who you are and that kind of thing?
Sure. I'm Jeff. I used to be a Microsoft MVP. Then I put my MVP award in the literal shredder. I actually put it in the shredder. The thing is about an open platform or open source programming language, why do you need a closed boys club? And why do we even have this closed boys club anyway? The program started turning into, can you please help us advocate for Azure? And it degraded into, here is all the content that we published this week in Azure. Maybe you might use it for your YouTube syndication. And we started seeing these incoming generations of people in the community. And when you look at some of their contributions, they've got a large amount of people on YouTube. They've got a large amount of people on Twitter. Now, there are a lot of people in the MVP program who are amazing, freaking amazing. So just because I don't find value in the program doesn't mean it's not valuable to you, right? Don't take this is not a personal thing, right? So I just didn't like the shape of the program, so I quit. So before the MVP program, I was an open source maintainer for quite a few projects in the .NET ecosystem. These days, I don't write .NET at all. I still love .NET, and I've left the .NET ecosystem. So this is another thing. So one of the things that happened in the .NET space recently, we actually had someone resign from the .NET Foundation, and they cited diversity of thought as the reason they left. They cited that specifically they were looking for an inclusive board of directors, which sounds great, but the person who resigned actually cited that, well, we just got all Microsoft fanboys here. We've got people who are all in the MVP program, all people who want to work at Microsoft. So that person quit from a diversity of thought point of view. But myself, open source maintainer for quite a long time in the .NET space. Made a lot of friends along the way, and I generally mean that. And these days I don't do .NET much anymore. But at the same time, that puts me in a unique position where I see all the different programming languages out there outside the .NET ecosystem and see where they're excelling. And I see where .NET is not excelling.
Sure, I can understand that. And it's always important to have a look around at the other. Imagine that we're doing physical manufacturing, we're doing physical engineering. The old phrase, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? And so if the only tool in your toolbox is .NET, you're going to approach things in a .NET way. In the same way that if all of the tools you have are Python, you're going to approach it in a Python way, right? Or JavaScript or Rust or Go or whatever, right? And so it's my personal opinion. It's quite important to every so often just look around, see what's happening, right? Personally, I'm learning a little Go in my own spare time, just because I'm like, hey, what's this Go language all about? Let's give it a try, right? Because otherwise, like you say, I'll always attack the same problems in the same way. And it may be that I'm trying to solve a problem in a way that isn't, I guess, relevant, So, for instance, if I'm in C# in .NET and I attack a problem that requires functional programming, or maybe F# or Haskell or, any of the other functional languages, they may be more relevant. And so it's better to, even if all you know is the name and the paradigm it uses, because then you can Google that stuff, right? You just got to Google Haskell functional programming, boom, you've got thousands of tutorials. F# functional programming, boom, you've got thousands of tutorials. I'm trying to sort of balance the .NET technologies versus the non-.NET technologies there, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Well, you're completely right. Look around. I don't know what it's like for yourself. Like, we go back 2 years ago when I was in Australia and I was looking around to all the .NET meetups, right? There were no one, very rare to see anyone under 30 there, right? And, to even see a woman there at a .NET meetup here in Australia doesn't exist, right? But if you go to any other meetups outside the .NET space, they're getting all the new brains, right? So what do you see at your meetups? So you look around, right, and you see problems. And these problems may not necessarily be tooling. It could be mindset and mind share. People aren't coming into the ecosystem. What happens if people don't come into the ecosystem?
Yeah, exactly, right? It starts to sort of get stale, I guess. I feel like perhaps JavaScript had this throughout the late 90s into the early 2000s, and then all these new thought processes came along, and now we've got Node, we've got NPM, we've got Express, we've got React, we've got Angular. Whether you think those are good things or bad things, that's a whole shed load of innovation right there, right?
Yeah, it's a new generation of people looking at things in a different way, right? Rather than a singular way, and this is the way we do it. We've got lots of young, brilliant minds in looking at how things are done differently. Now, there are a lot of problems in some of those ecosystems you mentioned. They have a library for, if something is to do a quality check, if something is null, that's a library in that ecosystem. They don't have a good standard library. But you look at what they're doing, if you're a junior software developer right now and you want a guaranteed job that's remote, you learn JavaScript. Guaranteed you're going to get a remote job. If you want a remote job and you're a .NET developer, is that even possible? They do exist, but a lot of them are governments, right? A lot of them are governments. So that there are problems with demographics here.
Sure. And there is a slightly spiky, hairy topic that I'm going to try and vary around, but it's something you brought up then. In my experience, now this is going to be different for everyone else, but in my experience, the majority of .NET devs are male, right? That is, in my opinion, a bad thing. We need as many different mindsets in as possible. And how we do that, I don't know. But maybe we should be looking to other languages and frameworks and figuring out how they're doing it, if they are doing it, and maybe adopting those ideas. I'm not sure. Like I say, that's a bit of a spiky, hairy topic. I'm a bit worried about the actual topic, if I'm completely honest, just because I don't want to exclude anyone.
Yeah, so look at the Rust community and how they run their community. They've got some very good ideas. So if you're doing a programming language on an ecosystem right now, look at Rust. They are the North Star everyone's looking at currently.
Okay. Have you any examples about what they're doing that is so fantastic that they're doing? Or is it just, hey, it's an exercise for the listener. Go check out Rust.
It's an exercise for the listener. Go look at Rust and look at, well, this is one of the reasons we're here to chat is right now .NET is produced by a single entity. And that singular entity, that shapes how the community thinks. And currently, well, at least in my observations, I think that the community seems very helpless. If Microsoft makes a decision, all they can do is, complain. They're not empowered to make changes, right? And if you look at that, from those type of dynamics of collective ownership, there is no collective ownership for this programming language that everyone uses in the .NET space. But if you look at Rust, for example, there is very much this feeling of collective ownership. They can make any changes they like. There is a process. But here in the .NET space, that is not true. So Microsoft has gone through a fantastic transformation. You can jump on YouTube and you can watch the API reviews, and that's lovely. I've done one in person, and that was mind-blowing. Massive respect for the team and those engineers there. It's a hard problem. But at the same time, it's not collective ownership.
I feel, though, just to try and take to use an example of a different programming language, you could perhaps go the other way and have, instead of having, the one entity sort of describing the journey that a language and tooling takes, you could go completely 180 degrees the other way and end up with PHP, right? Where there's almost no ownership, I feel, right? Because I've looked into some things like there are commands in that are in different human languages. So there are APIs some APIs are in English, some are in French, some are in Romanized Hebrew, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. It's just well, as someone who doesn't speak French or Hebrew or German or Portuguese, that represents a barrier to me, right? Maybe it's a good thing to go 180 degrees the other way and have almost no ownership and anyone can do anything and no oversight. Or maybe it's, where's the balance? It's a difficult balance, right?
Yeah, so we've got a pretty good standard library. We've just seen Mono reintegrate in with .NET. We've got Net Standard has disappeared. We actually now have a stable BCL. We got rid of the PCL drama, and that anyone who did multi-platform development during the PCL era, that was hell. So we actually now got a stable base library, and that is lovely. But it's not really about base libraries. The things that's happened in the community in the last month or so had nothing to do with the BCL or the design of the actual APIs. So to recap, some of the things that happened was the cat came out of the bag. .NET exists as a way to sell tooling, right? What happened was we had a feature that was added into the programming language, to the SDKs, and that's the correct place to add this feature, by the way. Because if you add that feature in at the programming language level, at the SDK level, then you've got a good shared primitive that all the products that use the programming language can integrate with. A good, solid baseline and foundation where people can build upon is really important. So what happened was we're talking about the hot reload. What happened was there was a decision came down to remove this feature from the programming language. So instead of actually having a shared foundation that all editors, and I'm talking about Visual Studio Code here, and Visual Studio for Windows, and I'm talking about anything, didn't matter. Instead of having that cool shared primitive, that was ripped out and put it only into Visual Studio for Windows, which hinders VS Code, by the way, because the shared primitive is removed. And that upset a lot of people, not just in the community, but actual people within Microsoft themselves, and actually created a large division to the point where internal engineers at Microsoft started leaking emails to the press.
Yeah, having seen the Twitter conversations that were going on at the time, I saw, the big names that everybody knows saying, we're sorry, we're working on this, we're trying to figure it out, not our decision, we're doing what we can. And whether that was them trying to do damage control for themselves, or whether that was them trying to say, hey, we genuinely have no call in this decision, I don't know. But I did see that. And I think that a lot of people I talked to sort of dismissed it. They were like, yeah, well, of course. But then, I pointed out that, for instance, the feature we're talking about is .NET Watch, right? Which is you can, from the command line, say, watch the entire repository, the entire source tree we're looking at, and perform an action when something changes. So you can run .NET Watch and say, rebuild everything or rerun everything wherever we're running. And you make a change to one of the files, and then the whole thing will rebuild. But then they improved on that and created this thing called hot reload, which meant that you could change a source file, and instead of rebooting the application that was running, it would rebuild it and do some really cool, I totally do not understand how they do it, but some like injection stuff. So you don't have to reboot the application. It just continues to run, but with the new code. And that's fantastic. And people were saying, but it makes sense that they would take it out. And I'm like, no, it doesn't, because you can actually see the git commit where they commented the code out,
That there is the problem. That there, right there, is the cat out of the bag. If you go to other programming languages and other ecosystems, like .NET Watch or .NET Hot Reload, the equivalent, exist in that ecosystem. And if they come around to the .NET ecosystem because they just want to try it out and that primitive doesn't exist, how are they going to react? And then, what happens if the people in the community, oh yeah, we had it, but we removed it, but you have to install Windows to get this feature. And you have to install Visual Studio to use this feature. It's like, I use Visual Studio Code on a Chromebook. No, stuff this, I'm going back to Golang. This is just as silly. But even to defend the decision, right? Even to defend the decision, because essentially what's happened is we've got an open programming language that's openly developed, and Microsoft doing a stellar good job with that, by the way. Really good job. And these bits were certified with a Go Live license. And it wasn't just a Go Live license. This was the LTS Go Live, meaning it's going to be supported for, I don't know how many, 4 or 5 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this was removed a couple of days before it shipped. Just removed. And how it was removed was a pull request was raised, the features were removed, it was self-merged, and then the conversation was locked. That's not right for an open platform, right? We had these features that are going to be really cool to allow all the editors in the world, Emacs, Vim, VS Code, Visual Studio for Windows, Visual Studio Mac, to build upon, and it gets ripped out because they want to put it as a feature to be sold. This is the key problem in the .NET space, is .NET exists to sell Visual Studio licenses.
I suppose a corollary might be somebody adds a new feature to the Linux kernel, and then, just before patch day, Linus Torvalds comes along and goes, no, we don't want that.
We don't want that because I've formed a proprietary company and I'm going to sell that feature.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see how a healthy open community can be even stomach that was a good idea and the best thing for a programming language. And it happened. So there was a large community uproar. I stirred some crap there as well. But we managed to get Microsoft to turn back on it. And they released this blog post saying, oh, it was a mistake. It was an accident. The entire community had seen all these different, we'll link it in the show notes. There's a good summary of it. But we're seeing all these key people in the Microsoft space, all the engineers, and they're all posting emojis of crying, crying cat emojis and stuff. You can see the internal conflict right there on Twitter, and it happened. And then this blog post came out saying it was an accident. And if you read that blog post, it's so clear that Scott Hunter is being a fall person. for the situation. And the decision came down, The Verge reported by leaked emails from Microsoft employees to The Verge saying, this person said, rip it out because we need to sell Visual Studio licenses.
That's when you realize that the story relating to a programming language that is maybe, the maintainers and the designers and everybody contributing towards it becomes almost mainstream when a site like The Verge is reporting on it, right? I saw it on the Register, but then the Register reports about, there's this problem with Node or this thing's happening in Go. So I didn't really see that as a yardstick myself of, oh my goodness, it's gone mainstream. But when The Verge picked it up, I was like, whoa, this is legitimately rather large. You might say it's a huge story, People from the outside, they've been seeing things boil up. It's about the third or fourth thing that's happened in the community. They might think, oh, this is a huge overreaction, but they haven't actually seen that there's been the few things that came before that. So we had the .NET Foundation took ownership of open source projects and without permission, without consent, and moved where those open source projects existed on GitHub. So instead of being part of a GitHub organization, they were moved into a enterprise GitHub organization. Now, the reasoning behind that makes sense. It makes sense. The reason they moved it in there was for succession and getting free access to code spaces and all that. It makes sense. The problem was a lack of consent. Mm-hmm.
People, they're open source projects, and some of these are actually businesses. There's businesses who have joined their IP into the foundation. That was moved without consent. And that blew up onto the register because there was no consent. Now, if we go back before that, a couple of weeks beforehand, we opened up the show and we're talking about a person who left the .NET Foundation. This was a person of color who left the .NET Foundation and in quitting said they just want people who are all races, genders, and ethnicity, but everyone is like, rah, 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 Microsoft is awesome. And this person joined the foundation for one reason, to advocate for the open source maintainers, not to advocate for Microsoft and Microsoft's use cases. And if we go back a little bit further, you might remember the .NET Maturity Ladder. So the .NET Maturity Ladder was a set of rules, which were like a way of graduating a project. It was basically pushing these rules down to say, to make your open source project more consumable by a billion-dollar company, this is what you need to do. So it was pushing this governance down on these unpaid maintainers to make it easier for the software to be consumed. Meanwhile, these open source maintainers have joined the .NET Foundation because they want support from the foundation, and the foundation is now pushing down these governance saying you need to change how your way of work does so it's easy for people to consume. And the maintainers are like, people are already consuming us. Left, right, center. That's the problem. We need support. And the foundation wasn't providing support. So all these things have been bubbling. So if you haven't been following the entire chain, it might seem like drama.
Yeah, I'll make a point of putting links to these stories in the show notes because I think it's rather important for .NET devs to know about, regardless of whether they are in the .NET Foundation or whether they're open source developers or not, because it's kind of important to know about the things that are happening with the tooling, right? And I'm not trying to be critical of Microsoft, and I'm also not trying to be supportive of Microsoft. I'm trying to take the middle ground in this conversation, just to say, look, okay, let's just get these news items out there in the open for people to know about, because I'm not, like I say, I'm not trying to form an opinion of them. I'm just trying to say, hey, maybe you all should have a look at these things.
Well, thank you. It's good to have a moderating voice. I don't do .NET anymore. I should be looking at other things, but at the same time, I in the other things, I look back into .NET and I see, wow, there's some stuff that needs changing here. Really, really needs changing here. Now, I don't speak for the entire community, and the maintainers in that community aren't the community. .NET is a huge space, like massive. if you ever get the chance to sit down with a .NET product manager and poke them in the ribs and say, but how many WinForms applications are created every day? And you'll see it in their eyes. Like, WinForms is still one of their biggest use cases of .NET. Right? .NET is huge, but why this matters is the people in the .NET Foundation are the open source maintainers that those WinForm developers consume. Without them, there is no open source community. Without no open source community, then there is no compelling reason to use .NET. Because the reason businesses now use open source is because they can get stuff done faster.
Mm-hmm.
So you can go to TypeScript and you can go to NPM and you want to integrate with some third-party SaaS offering. You bet your bottom dollar, you don't even have to think about it. That SDK exists. Can you say the same with hand on heart, guaranteed that with that confidence, it exists in .NET? Or are you still building that .NET, that SDK for .NET? And that's why it's really important to care for the open source community and those maintainers. That's why they matter, because they're the growth of the platform.
Absolutely. As an example, I don't think the DevOps revolution would have happened were it not for the open source tooling around DevOps things. You know, the creation of the YAML language, the gluing together of different tools to build and release and things like that. Git and GitHub /GitLab / all of the other implementations of a distributed version control system using Git and SVN. Had these things not existed, DevOps wouldn't have happened, right? And so, like you say, all businesses rely on open source at some point in the stack, just because it's so much faster rather than building something from scratch that would pull from a Git source and do the build. You can rely on the fact that Git has a webhook that will raise an API request when certain actions happen, which is how the majority of these DevOps systems work, right?
Yeah, so here's a scenario. Company A is using TypeScript.
Mm-hmm.
And all their packages exist on NPM. They can just glue together libraries and then ship business value. Company B is in .NET. The SDK doesn't exist, and your engineers need to build that SDK. Company A is winning.
Yep.
So there's ecosystem things that need resolving. So when people fawn over Microsoft, and we don't critically say these are our problems and we need to work on our problems and work to a point of collective ownership, then we got problems.
Yeah, and I think it's important to be able to criticize something that you enjoy using, you enjoy doing, or whatever, something that you love. I can't remember whether I said it earlier in the recording or offline when we were chatting just before, but I'm a keen video game player, and I feel like it's very important to say, hey, I love this movie, but my goodness, does it have problems? Or, hey, I love this book, but there are definitely some problems with it, and here are my problems that I have with it. But then being able to take that and say, let's try and create a constructive criticism, right? Not just to criticize and say, oh, it's a lot of nonsense and it's no good. You know, waving the banner and saying .NET is no good isn't going to help anyone, in the same way that waving a banner and saying Go or Rust or TypeScript is no good doesn't help anyone, right? The long-standing joke of making fun of NPM because X, Y, or Z, right, doesn't help. At that point, it becomes background noise. You know, people who say, oh, JavaScript, blah, 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 blah. Well, I'm like, guess what? Your competitors are using that technology. And like you said there, Jeff, they're winning. They already have a product on the market. It may be a little bit janky in places, but guess what? They have a product, people are using it, and people are paying for it. You know, at the end of the day, your boss, your client, your customer, whoever, doesn't care how it was built, just that it has been built.
Yeah.
If I use a car analogy, I don't care how the gas gets injected into the engine and then an explosion happens, which drives a piston, which then is turned into circular. None of that matters. What matters is when I press on the gas pedal, and if I'm in gear and I don't have the handbrake on, the car moves in the direction that I want it to move in.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter about whether it's built with an electric engine or a gas-using engine or some other engine that uses hydrogen or whatever. I push on the gas pedal and I go forward. That's what I care about.
grab some popcorn and find your seats. Monster of the Week Actual Play Podcast $2 Creature Feature returns for Season 2 on February 22nd. This season, we'll see a whole new crew of hunters confronting the mysteries at the heart of the town of Jupiter Hollow.
I'm Megan Murphy. I'm playing Zelda Wardwell, the Flake. Oh, wait, I'm supposed to protect people too. That's like what heroes do.
I'm Nyelder, playing Eric Ashrin, the Crooked. Let's just say I don't ask questions that involve textbooks. I ask questions that involve cash.
I'm Laura McMillan, and I'm playing Tammy Jo Marple, your hometown home finder. I'm here to make deals with the good people of Jupiter Hollow, but I already made a deal of my own. Tammy Jo is the monstrous.
And I'm Mr. Ray. I play everything that tries to kill these people. And if you enjoyed our first season, you ain't seen nothing yet.
New episodes every other Tuesday, wherever podcasts are found.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby to get ourselves.
So I don't want to spend all this time pointing out problems.
Sure.
I have some ideas on how the community, but it really depends on the community itself. If they're okay with this status quo, or they themselves want to see and they feel this way. So I'll give you another example of a problem. .NET exists to sell Visual Studio tooling, and it has for a longest time, right? What year is this? It's 2021? This is going to air in 2022? Isn't there a thing called Azure, right? Why are we still focusing on selling licenses for Visual Studio and shaping a programming language for license on Visual Studio when there's Azure? Isn't that like Steve Ballmer style old world thinking? Like, we've got to like compete against all the tooling vendors. But isn't it meant to be all about Azure now? So if it's all about Azure now, why are they ripping out features from the programming language just because JetBrains might use it? What? Okay, so Microsoft made Visual Studio Code. Why is it that Rust and Golang has better support in Visual Studio Code than C#? What? Microsoft made VS Code. Why is C# support in VS Code worse than Rust and Golang? What's going on there? Like, I would suspect that is a symptom of .NET being a thing used to sell Visual Studio for Windows licenses. If that dynamic didn't exist, we wouldn't have this weird dynamic where Rust works better on a Microsoft product than .NET. Now, I should be clear there. I said .NET. The F# community is doing a banging job. Ironide, those team there, they're awesome. If you want an awesome experience of F#, go get Ironide and VS Code. It's one of the best experiences. But when it comes to C#, and C# is not .NET, don't make that mistake. Trust me, you'll start a tribal war. You need to be questioning why VS Code has some of the worst support for .NET out there. Why? Because like someone who's coming across from Rust or Golang, they're using VS Code in their day-to-day, and then they load up C# in VS Code, and I'm like, what the heck's going on here?
Yeah, I have to say, I help out with some students at a local college, and I do know that even though they have the MSDN AA licenses, most of them are using Visual Studio Code, right? So maybe that's a symptom of what's happening when they're like, well, I could use the MSDN AA license I've been given, but let's call a spade a spade. Visual Studio Code opens way faster.
Mm-hmm.
And if I have 45 minutes to get my work done, I'm going to use the tool that starts faster. And maybe that is because Visual Studio is, I don't want to use the word bloated, but it's like Visual Studio is the Swiss Army knife of IDEs. It has so much stuff. And 90% of the time using a text editor, IntelliSense, and F5.
Yeah. In 2022, when this ships, what editor someone uses should not matter anymore. It's all about Azure. So this is the call to action, right? So if you go to GitHub and go github.com/open-.net, you'll see a .github repository. And we're starting to catalog some of these things. Like, Here's another one of these oddities. When you go to the official .NET website, so remember, .NET is a platform. If you were to go to the official Rust website, they're like, oh yeah, use Emacs, use Vim, use all these things. The official .NET website only lists Visual Studio as being compatible. If this is a truly open platform, why is it only listing Visual Studio? Why isn't there a section there for JetBrains? Why isn't there a section there for like OmniSharp or VS Code, right? Or why isn't there showing like the Vim? Like if it's a truly open programming language, open platform, why is it only pushing this relationship that we've seen the last month has caused a great deal of stress in the community?
I do have to say that as a counter to that, although it isn't the first thing that people new to .NET will see, I do know that Scott Hanselman has changed his language when he talks about .NET stuff. He uses the phrase, however you like. Build it however you like. If you want to use Emacs, you want to use Vim, go do it. My problem with saying that is that unless I find those talks, unless I find those videos, I'm not going to hear a Microsoft employee say that. And like I say, I'm trying to be sort of middle of the road and moderate here. Maybe not moderate, but try and stay middle of the road. But I tend to agree with you on that one. If I'm new to a thing, let's say I've joined a boot camp, right? And they've said, right, go to get.net/6 or whatever the URL is, because it confuses people when you say try.net because that's the URL to run .NET in your browser, right? But whatever you do, let's say you go to .net/download or whatever it is. And the first thing you see is works brilliantly with Visual Studio. You're going to go, oh, well, I'd better go get Visual Studio as well. Now, yes, there is a free version of it. Now, I'm going to say these things. The license can change as I say this. So please do your own due diligence. As far as I'm aware, Visual Studio Community, which is the full version of Visual Studio with some things taken out, is available for open source for people in education and for people in teams that are smaller than a set size. So you can get a version of Visual Studio for free. But again, the problem there is you got to have Windows. You said earlier on, Jeff, I'm on a Chromebook. And right now, I'm sitting here with a machine running Pop! OS. So I'm happy with JetBrains Rider or with Visual Studio Code. Yeah, okay, so my experience with Visual Studio Code is a little bit janky, and I can never get IntelliSense working. But for the very tiny projects that I'm working on of a single program.cs file or a single F# file, that works for me, but it maybe doesn't scale for people who are in large open source projects or even in the enterprise. I don't know, because I'm not working on a large enterprise project in Visual Studio Code. So what I'm saying is I don't see these problems because I'm not in that target demographic.
Yeah, so I highly recommend people do the analysis. Come join us at open-.net. That actually is a URL. We'll link it in the show notes. And right now, it's just a GitHub repository where we're just cataloging these things. There's talks about, hey, what happens if we start producing a build? Right? And people are like, wait a sec, how can you compete with Microsoft? And I go, what happens if that's not the goal? Right? What if it's just about collective ownership of .NET? Like, does the community even know how to build its own programming language? Right, because right now it's very hard to build the .NET programming language from source. Mm-hmm. So if it's hard to build the .NET programming language from source, then how are you going to get like university students hacking on it?
Sure.
The new brains coming into the ecosystem. I'll give you another good example of a difference between ecosystems. Jamie, have you ever pulled down a open source package from NuGet and you found a bug in it?
I haven't. When I pull NuGet packages, I know the thing I want to do with it. And yeah, okay, let's use newtonsoft.json, right? It exposes thousands of APIs. But if I'm just serializing and deserializing some object, I'm going to do what I know in that. Then I'm going to move on to something else, right? But yeah, I've never found an actual bug in a NuGet package.
Okay, so it does happen, right? Bugs are in software. So let's use Newton JSON, for example, and let's add contrast to a different ecosystem. So say there is a bug in Newton Soft JSON in the serialization, maybe to do with UTF encoding. A huge possibility, right? Mm-hmm. How would you compile a custom version of JSON.NET? Could you walk me through the steps on how you compile a custom version of .NET. Currently, you have your customer project, and that customer project references a NuGet package. You can't use that NuGet package because it's got a bug. Can you step me through the steps that you would have to do to make a one-line change, please?
So I guess I'd see whether it has a GitHub repo, go over to the GitHub repo or the GitLab repo or the DVCS solution of choice, right? I'd fork that repo so that then I can make my own changes, clone it down to my machine, make the change, run .NET build if it was a .NET thing, hope that it works, change like the project ID or the version number, and then I would do a .NET pack and hope that it would package that up to a NuGet file for me, and then I would point my customer project, my client project at that localized package and rerun the thing and hope that it all works. That's what I would do.
That's exactly the steps. Now, what happens if you made a mistake in your patching and you need to do that again?
Ooh.
You think that you fix that one-line thing, and all of a sudden we're talking about a dev loop cycle. How do you get a dev loop cycle going? So that's how the world exists in .NET currently. Now, if we look outside the .NET space and say in the Golang space, or let's specifically look at the JavaScript space, there is a package called patch package on NPM and GitHub. How that works is lovely. Because Node is a source-based programming language, now, when people hear source-based, they probably think slow. That's just because the tooling hasn't been invested. There are source-based programming languages that can work just as fast as a compiled language, but that's outside of this talk. There's so much research that's happened outside of the .NET space when it comes to build system tooling. Now, there's some cool things in MS Build as well, but I'm getting off topic. Anyway, so patch package, what it does is if you want to get a dev loop going, so you've got a customer project, and with that customer project, you find a bug in the dependency, like JSON, whatever, you can just edit that change and you run npm space create patch. And that will store the patch in your source control of your customer project. And then when you do npm restore, it applies the patch on top.
Right, okay.
That is the dev loop that the Node ecosystem has for interfacing with open source software. This is the dev loop that Golang people do when they interface with open source software. In the .NET space, we've got this nightmare scenario of how it works. And as an open source maintainer, what we see is people going, can you please create a release to fix this bug fix? Because I'm at $1 billion business and I can't release this project, and you're pulling the rug out of me and you're being a jerk because you haven't released this thing. And meanwhile, the person's like, I could be watching Netflix and you're being a jerk to me. So no, I'm going to watch Netflix instead. The state of our tooling that exists right now in the .NET space, because it is owned by Visual Studio as a sellable thing, they go out and they do research of their big customers and they build the tool that those big customers want. Meanwhile, the tooling scenario I just discussed does not get built. But the open source maintainers have built this for their programming language and their ecosystem because they know the pain. So they're fixing their own problems. But the thing is, by fixing a scenario like that, it makes it better for the entire ecosystem, even for those bigger companies. That is an example of how products are developed. A big company that's doing WinForms is all talking about supply chain security and worrying they're going to get hacked. So all the product management effort or the engineering effort is towards making sure that everything's signed and secure. Meanwhile, that big company doesn't even realize what they're doing, and nagging open source maintainers is a bad thing. It's putting these pressures on the people who create things, but in other ecosystems, this problem doesn't even exist because they build shared primitives for the programming language instead of optimizing for software licensing sales.
So there's a couple of things you mentioned there, I suppose, as one of them. In the closed source enterprise world, there is a situation where presumably, because the code is closed source, you're using your own NuGet feed. And so you never get into a situation where it's 2 a.m. and you're getting emails from someone saying, please do the release because I can't ship this software because my business is going to be suffering because I need you to ship the release with this fix for the bug. Because if it's all internal and it's closed source, you're pointing at the NuGet feed all day, and you're going to get the latest version. And if you need a new build, you go poke the person who's sitting probably 3 chairs down, who then creates the new build, right?
Yeah, exactly. And in the .NET space, people look to say, no, this is the way it's done. And this is the only way it's done. In other programming languages that are collectively owned, an ecosystem they collectively own, they'll have lots of different ways. Yes, I'm aware that there's things like FSMake and other things that exist in the world. I'm not ignorant of that. I'm saying you need to look that there's so much more that the .NET space is missing out on. I don't do .NET day to day anymore. I used to. It was one of the first ways I cut my way into this space. Go look outside the ecosystem because there are great ideas, but currently those great ideas will only get built if they get prioritized and through that. So people ask, well, if you're going to do an open .NET, what does that even look like? The answer is, I don't know. If you feel similar to how I feel about these things, maybe a collective of people come together, and that would be quite lovely. We're tracking these meta problems to help .NET mature to what it needs to be, which is an open platform. Or maybe people get together and they start wanting to create builds. And if you start having builds, side-by-side builds, like there's .NET and Open.NET, then all of a sudden we have this ability to play around. The community has the ability to play around. They're no longer blocked on Microsoft saying yes or no. We have ownership. And we start playing around and like, hey, that idea from Rust is pretty cool. What happens if we were to create an experimental build? And this experimental build is to fix that problem of like patch package. The goal isn't for that experimental branch to like get the mass adoption and create some rifts and forks in the ecosystem. That's not the goal. The point is, let's look at things differently. And the community right now, because we don't have collective ownership, can't look at things differently at all. Because they all have a blocking thing on Microsoft. So the community has the ability to create builds. Now, we have sponsors from Circle CI, and we're looking at FOSS so all the infrastructure is coming together to be able to create builds. What do you want to do now? That's why we've created a special interest group in the official .NET Discord channel.
Oh, right. Okay.
So in the official .NET Discord channel, there is now a SIG called Open.NET. People are coming together and we're discussing, like, what could this be? Things need to be better.
I'm conscious that people may take the things that we've talked about as huge negatives and we're being non-constructive. But I think there's something that you said there about if we can get an open.NET build, we can hack around, we can play around, see if we can implement these features. And then presumably, if there was a requirement for it, you could maybe pull request that back to the main .NET source tree and say, hey, Microsoft folks, I know you don't have time to look into this, but we've done some playing around. Check out what we've tried to do. What do you think?
Exactly.
We've created this ability to do this brand new, wonderful thing that no one's ever thought of. Doesn't exist in any other language. We've spent some time investigating it. What do you think? Instead
of bitching at Microsoft of like, oh, you need to do this, that, the community has power to go try their things if they want. So really it's up to people to go look at GitHub, go join the Discord and help shape. Like if this is interesting, come do it. That's the reason that it exists as a SIG. Deliberately when creating this, I wanted to create this as a SIG in the existing community, not to split the community. The second thing I want is fix the foundational issues with the .NET Foundation. There is some foundational issues with the incorporation documents of the .NET Foundation, which basically makes the .NET Foundation powerless. The .NET Foundation and their board can't do anything unless it's like Microsoft has this like Mark Zuckerberg supervote over it. So the .NET Foundation is meant to be truly independent of .NET, but how can it be truly independent of .NET if there's like a Zuckerberg supervote that whether any motion can pass or not? And I'd like the Open.NET to join the .NET Foundation. Because if the Open.NET thing and the community forms and they start hacking away on things and it's part of the same foundation and that foundation owns the same intellectual property as .NET, then it makes it very easy to, intellectual property-wise, take ideas from downstream from the community and put them back upstream.
Yeah. So I was a little worried going into this conversation. Like I said, not constructive. But I think everything you're saying here is saying you've identified this issue, and you've actually come up with a way of maybe not the immediate solution, but hey, here's how we could work together as a group to figure out the right solution.
Yeah.
And I think you're hitting all the right points, in my opinion. Now, I'm not a Microsoft employee. I don't work on the .NET stuff, but it's all making sense to me that, hey, if there is this special interest group that can say, hey, why don't we try this? Why don't we try that? It all makes sense to me.
Thank you. Because I just see a .NET community who's continually bitching at Microsoft, and you've seen the last 10 years, even Microsoft's gone through this massive transformation. Not enough. The hot reload proves there's still some people who need to retire from the org and who don't get it. And the internal culture war between the engineering and the product management and the business decisions where emails were leaked to The Verge prove that as well. The community itself hasn't gone through an evolution. They're still stuck in the sitting back and complaining and whinging mode, even though all the source code is open. But that's because no one has really said, hey, look, how do we build this thing? What are the problems that's stopping us from being an open platform? And from which point, hopefully Microsoft can come up and say, look, hey, put up or shut up. Like, we're not going to take your pull request, but go play with this motley crew. Go play with them, and if you get something cool, then raise a design proposal or like back upstream, and then maybe we got some sort of like IP sharing going between the ecosystems. Or maybe people decide to take it in a completely different way. Maybe it doesn't join the .NET Foundation. Maybe it joins the Apache Foundation. Maybe something like AWS comes along and says, nah, we're going to do like the same we did with OpenJDK. We're going to do a proper open.NET. Don't know. Turn up, have a discussion, and let's see what happens.
That's it. You see, this is the thing, right? What a lot of people don't realize is that .NET as it is now, so .NET 6, I guess, at the time of recording, is an implementation of the .NET standard. And so it is perfectly within at least the words that Microsoft have used to describe .NET to then go implement your own. Or it should be. I don't know whether it is. Like you say, how do we build it? You should be able to fork it, build your own.
There shouldn't be a complete crisis. Like, forks are a natural part of open source.
Mm-hmm.
Now, one thing that to be clear is there's been a great deal of engineering effort to reunify the BCL. I would consider any sort of fracture of the BCL as being a stupidly bad idea. You need to look at Python 2 and Python 3 for example of the problems it causes in ecosystems. But that doesn't mean you can't take things like build tooling in a different way. If MS Build doesn't exist, what would it look like? Or what are the changes we need to make MS Build to enable some of these scenarios, like patch package, etc.? And also, people might not realize this, but this is an example of just how fractured .NET is at a shared primitive level. Do you know .NET Debugger is proprietary?
I didn't know that.
The .NET Debugger is proprietary, so Microsoft ships a programming language that cannot be debugged unless you pay for commercial tooling. And because of this, projects such as LinkPad, DNSpy, Samsung, JetBrains, the Mono project, the Unity project have all had to reinvent the wheel and write their own debugger. The heck? It's 2022. Isn't this meant to be about Azure? Why are all these really cool companies having to write their own debugger? The reason that they have to write their own debugger is because they want to sell more Visual Studio for Windows licenses. Isn't it meant to be about Azure?
See, that's the thing. It occurs to me now that obviously Codespaces is a thing that is an officially offered project technically by GitHub, but GitHub is owned by Microsoft. So, and you can spin up a code space to do your .NET development. Let's say, right? Let's say you live entirely in a Linux or Unix world. So you're on Mac OS, you're on FreeBSD, you're on Linux, one of the many Linuxes. So you can't get Visual Studio for Windows. That's fair enough. Okay. So you live inside a Visual Studio Code, and then you go, I want to build it on a server. That way I can use a throwaway machine. So you get yourself your GitHub Spaces. Well, I haven't done it, but I'm left wondering, because GitHub Spaces for .NET is entirely Visual Studio Code in a Docker container on the cloud. So like the back of my mind, everything you've been saying, I'm then wondering, well, what's the debugging experience like on that if these tech tools and library features are removed or can be removed? And if the debugger is proprietary, how do I successfully debug in the cloud?
So exactly. Now, the reason that VS Code and C# suck is because they want to sell Visual Studio for Windows licenses, right? It's plainly clear that that's the product direction. Like, they remove things from the SDK so they can sell Visual Studio for Windows features. It seems that the VS Code for C# is chronically underfunded, right? And that means when people are going to use it on GitHub code spaces, the experience is not going to be great. Golang and Rust work better on GitHub code spaces than C# does. Like, it's actually shooting themselves in the foot.
At the time of recording, JetBrains have just announced they have a project that will do the same thing. It will be a similar thing to code spaces, but using JetBrains stuff. And I know that JetBrains, like you said, they have their own debugger, they have their own toolchain, they have their own all sorts of stuff. So I wonder whether this is one of the reasons why JetBrains are offering that now.
I don't know.
Because it may be easier. Who can say, right? Who can say?
It's a good thing, though. We're talking about a programming language now. If everything's meant to be about Azure and selling compute hours, who cares if there's like 20 different tooling vendors? It doesn't matter. That's success. That means more people are going to use it, more choice.
Mm-hmm.
So if we were back 13 years ago, I understand that logic of wanting to sell licenses for Visual Studio for Windows. It's 2022. It's about Azure. Why are we hindering a programming language?
I guess it's like if you were to buy a pair of Nike trainers or Nike sneakers and you could only use the Nike laces to do up the sneakers, right? So then when the laces break, you got to go back to the Nike store, presumably without any shoes on, because you can't put your shoes on, buy the Nike laces to do up your Nike trainers, right? I've said Nike way too many times. I don't want people to think that we're somehow sponsored by them, but it was an example, right?
Yeah. I guess we've been going for a while. We should wrap. The final thing I'll have to say is on the same day that the GitHub CEO stepped down, the person that looked after and did the hot reload thing to the community was promoted, and GitHub now reports to that person. That's all I've got to say.
Well, okay. Let's say folks are listening to this and they want to help out. They want to investigate some more. Regardless of whether we're saying that .NET is good or bad, they're just like, hey, I want to learn some more. Is the GitHub repository the best place to go? Or if you're in the Discord server, find the special interest group. What's the best way to find out?
Yeah, the best thing is go to open-.net, which redirects to github.com/open-.net, or join the special interest group. This stage is really, can we form a community of people who want to see, have collective ownership of their tooling? That's the first step. See who turns up. Do people care about this as much as I care about this? And if they do, then it's like, okay, well, I started a thing. I'm going to give it to you. You know more than me. I'm going to hand this over to you. I'm already starting thinking about succession because, like, this is really important in open source. You should plan from succession from day one. So if a whole bunch of AWS employees turn up and say, hell yeah, let's do this. So like, hey, here you go. Here's the keys. You're funded. You can do this much better than I can. I just started the thing. I'm just putting together a community. So if you like the idea of exploring what a collectively owned version of .NET looks like, then come join the community.
Totally. Okay. That sounds like a great idea. We'll make sure we put the links into the show notes. I'll also link to the stories we've talked about so far today. What about getting in touch with you then? Is it Twitter? Is it lean out the window and yell? What's the best way to find out more about you, Geoff?
Ghuntley.com. You'll find me there. I'm on Twitter. Easy to find. I'm passionate about these topics. You can probably tell from the recording. Come hang out and share ideas, but it's a big surface area. I even myself, I'm still thinking about what the right approach to this is. And the answer is, I don't know enough. I don't know. And hopefully there are people around will form who have a better idea. And hopefully there'll be Microsoft engineers who see what we're doing here as a positive thing and not a hostile thing, and maybe they will start helping out. Like, I've thought about, like, what happens if we started bringing back the old school Channel 9 videos? Remember the old school ones that used to sit down on a couch and the camera used to fly around and you used to learn so much, but your brain would melt? Maybe we can get some of that going. Maybe it's like, hey, we need to build .NET. We have no idea how to build .NET. Can you come on our YouTube and, like, sit down and teach the community how to build .NET? Like, and get some mentoring and open community and collective ownership going. That would be wild and amazing.
Yeah, that would be really cool. Like watching a YouTube series on, okay, so let's pull the .NET source code. Let's run it through .NET build, because presumably .NET is written in C# against the .NET tooling. So I should be able to just push F5 and build it. Whether that's the case or not, I don't know. I've not tried it. Maybe that should be an exercise for the listener. Go ahead and pull the .NET CLR source code and see if you can build it.
Yeah, there's an issue on GitHub that will give you some more tips. There was a lot of effort invested by the engineering team to do reproducible builds from source, because if you're shipping something like from Fedora or Debian, they have rules that everything must compile from source. So if you want to head down this path, you look at how Debian Fedora build .NET and use that as your starting point, because otherwise you have to worry about syndication of different release schedules between different teams here. And yeah, it's a complicated topic, but maybe we create documentation together. Maybe we start education together. Maybe this seems easier. And if something bad was happening in the .NET community again, this time around, it's like, yep, we're ready to go. We got a fork. We can do whatever. We've got collective ownership.
Yep. From our conversation, that's what I'm taking. It is not a case of let's be really hostile and create an open source version and try and push Microsoft out of the way. It's like, hey, how can we help by making the whole thing open source and seeing if we can investigate how to solve some of these problems that other programming languages and frameworks have solved?
Yeah, and it's also insurance in case .NET hot reload was to happen again.
Sure. Well, I'll tell you what, Jeff, I've taken up a lot of your time this morning for you, this evening for me, because time zones are fun, right? So what I'll say is, thank you ever so much for being on the show, Jeff. I really, really appreciate it. I think that this is an important conversation to have, and that maybe it will help the listeners to maybe sort of sit back and have a critical thinking moment of, what if .NET went away? Or what if this one feature in the .NET tooling that I use goes away? Because that's the whole point of open source, right? What if it goes away?
What happens if we could just do it without having to beg Microsoft to do it? Like, currently the contribution model is, I have an idea, beg Microsoft to add it, and they go, nope. Or they say yes. They say yes quite a lot, but they say nope. And then what? The community is just lots of individual people that have said no to. Like, what happens if all those people have said no to were all working together towards something? Wouldn't that be wild? And hopefully that starts happening. And it's an open platform, open community, an open language with good shared primitives that aren't ripped out to sell commercial software licenses.
Yep, that's it. I would encourage all the listeners to go check out open.net, because I think it's an important project. Regardless of whether the licensing or the commercial side of it, I think it's from my point of view, it'd be a good idea to try and experiment with some stuff and try and push it back upstream. That's what I'm taking. I know that there's a lot of other things going on, but I try to see the positive, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, so what I'll say, Jeff, is thank you so much for spending your time and talking about this, because it's a hot topic, but it's a topic that is important to discuss, and it's important to get excited about, I think, but excited in a good way, not let's go and grr with the pitchforks and the flames on the end of our torches and stuff. Let's just have a civil discussion about it. So I thank you very much, Jeff, for having that discussion with me.
No problem. This started from an emotional standpoint for a lot of people in the community, and it'll be lovely to get towards rational and start planning what this could look like. But first step is people come, let's chat.
Sure, excellent. Thank you ever so much.
No problem.
That was my interview with Geoffrey Huntley about open.net. Be sure to check out the show notes for a bunch of links to some of the stuff that we covered and a full transcription of the interview. The show notes, as always, can be found at .netcore.show, and there will be a link directly to them in your podcatcher. And don't forget to spread the word. Leave me a rating or review on your podcatcher of choice. Head over to dotnetcore.show/subscribe for ways to do that, or reach out via our contact page. The link for that will be in the show notes. And to come back next time for more .NET goodness. I'll see you again real soon. See you later, folks. The .NET Core podcast is a production of RJJ Software Limited.